The Homestead in Hot Springs, Virginia, has been welcoming guests since 1766, making it the oldest continuously operating resort in the United States by a margin that its nearest competitor cannot approach. 23 American presidents have stayed there. The building that stands today, the Georgian Revival Tower, completed in 1902, sits on 2,300 acres in the Allegheny Mountains, a physical scale that communicates institutional permanence with a precision that no marketing document could replicate. The resort's hot springs have been drawing visitors since the colonial period, before the United States existed as a political entity, before the Constitution was drafted, before the republic whose presidents would eventually sleep in its rooms had been imagined by anyone. The Homestead filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January 2016. The filing was not caused by the hot springs losing their temperature. It was not caused by the mountains moving. It was not caused by the departure of the guests who had been coming to those mountains for 230 years. It was caused by a private equity acquisition structure that had placed on a 230-year-old resort in a remote mountain location the debt service obligations of a leveraged buyout engineered for a market cycle that ended before the exit strategy could be executed. KSL Capital Partners, a Denver-based private equity firm specializing in travel and leisure assets, acquired the Homestead in 2013 from ClubCorp, which had owned the resort since the early 1990s after acquiring it from Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, which had owned it since 1914. The Homestead's ownership history is itself a forensic document. A rubber company, a country club operator, and a private equity firm are not the natural succession of stewards for a colonial-era resort whose commercial identity is inseparable from its historical continuity. Each ownership transferred a liability that the next ownership was required to absorb, and KSL's acquisition added the most structurally demanding liability of all: the expectation of a private equity return on a 230-year-old asset in a market that private equity timelines were not designed to accommodate. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. KSL Capital Partners acquired the Homestead in 2013 with a financing structure that reflected the private equity sector's standard approach to travel and leisure assets. A combination of equity and senior secured debt sized to a stabilized value projection that assumed the resort could be repositioned and sold within a typical private equity holding period of 3 to 5 years at a return that justified the acquisition premium. That structure had worked for KSL in other travel and leisure assets. It had not been tested against an asset with the specific characteristics of the Homestead. The covenant that nobody read carefully enough was the one written into the Homestead's relationship with its own history. A private equity holding period of 3 to 5 years requires a buyer at exit who is willing to pay a price that delivers the projected return. The universe of buyers willing and able to pay that price for a 2,300-acre resort in a remote Virginia mountain location, with the capital expenditure obligations of a building portfolio averaging more than a century in age, the operational complexity of a full-service historic resort dependent on a customer base that had been cultivating its relationship with the property across generations, and a debt service requirement sized to private equity return expectations, is not a large universe in any market cycle. It is a particularly small universe in a market cycle that had begun shifting against large-format resort assets in secondary and tertiary locations before KSL's acquisition closed. The luxury travel market was moving toward boutique, experiential, and internationally branded properties at a rate that the Homestead's scale, its remoteness, and its generational customer base insulated it from partially, but not completely. The guests who came to the Homestead came because their parents had come and their grandparents had come. That loyalty was a genuine commercial asset. It was not an asset that generated the revenue growth trajectory that a private equity return model required. The debt service coverage ratio fell below covenant threshold as the resort's operating performance failed to reach the stabilized projections that the acquisition financing had required. The Chapter 11 filing in January 2016 came 2.5 years after the acquisition closed, approximately halfway through the minimum holding period that the exit strategy required. At what point does a private equity return model become structurally incompatible with the operating reality of a generational hospitality asset? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology applied to the Homestead at the time of KSL's 2013 acquisition faced a specific challenge that the standard hospitality asset valuation framework is not designed to address: how to price 230 years of institutional continuity as a component of a commercial asset's total value, without treating that continuity as a guarantee of future revenue that the market had not validated in the form required by a private equity capital structure. The appraisal stabilized revenue projections treated the Homestead's generational customer loyalty as a revenue-generating asset whose cash flows could be modeled with the same confidence applied to a stabilized urban business hotel with a documented corporate account base. That treatment was not analytically wrong in isolation. It was structurally inadequate because it failed to price the specific fragility of generational loyalty as a revenue source. It is durable across normal market conditions, but not scalable at the rate a private equity return model requires. And it is vulnerable to the specific disruption of a repositioning effort that attempts to attract a new customer demographic without alienating the existing one. KSL's repositioning strategy for the Homestead involved capital investment in amenities and programming designed to attract a younger, more affluent demographic to supplement the resort's traditional generational customer base. That strategy was commercially coherent in the abstract. In execution, it required capital expenditure that compressed the resort's operating cash flows at precisely the moment when the debt service covenant required those cash flows to grow. The repositioning investment reduced the short-term operating performance that the covenant required while targeting long-term revenue growth that the holding period did not allow enough time to materialize. The independent appraisal conducted in the context of the Chapter 11 proceeding valued the Homestead at a figure that reflected the distressed market conditions of early 2016 and the limited universe of buyers for an asset of its specific characteristics. That figure was materially below the 2013 acquisition price, documenting the gap between the stabilized value projection that had justified the acquisition financing and the market clearing value that the bankruptcy proceeding required the asset to establish. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The private equity ownership model applied to the Homestead rests on a set of assumptions about operational improvement, market positioning, and exit timing that the asset's specific characteristics made individually plausible and collectively unachievable within the structural constraints of a leveraged buyout. KSL Capital Partners brought genuine hospitality expertise to the Homestead. The firm had operated other resort assets successfully and had a documented track record in the travel and leisure sector. The failure at the Homestead was not a failure of management competence. It was a failure of structural design, the application of a financial engineering model to an asset whose operating reality was incompatible with the model's core assumptions. The architecture of denial in this case is distributed across three parties rather than concentrated in a single ownership decision. KSL denied that the private equity return timeline was incompatible with the Homestead's generational customer base and its capital expenditure requirements. The lenders who financed the acquisition denied that the stabilized revenue projections could not be achieved within the covenant timeline. And ClubCorp, the selling entity, priced the Homestead at a level that reflected the private equity market's appetite for travel and leisure assets in 2013, rather than the asset's standalone operating value under a capital structure sized to its actual cash flows. Each party's denial was individually rational. ClubCorp was selling at a market peak and received full price. KSL was acquiring with an established operational playbook and reasonable confidence in its repositioning thesis. The lenders were underwriting against stabilized projections consistent with KSL's track record in comparable assets. The collective result of three individually rational decisions was a capital structure that required the Homestead to perform at a level its 230-year operating history had never consistently achieved, and that its specific market position, remote, generational, and large format, was structurally unlikely to achieve within the timeframe the debt service covenants specified. The resort's most historically significant feature, its continuity across more than 2 centuries, was simultaneously its greatest commercial asset and its greatest structural liability in a private equity context. The generational loyalty that had sustained the Homestead through the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression could not be converted into a private equity return on a 3 to 5 year timeline. The Homestead emerged from Chapter 11 in 2017 under the ownership of IHG Hotels and Resorts, which acquired the resort out of the bankruptcy proceeding at a price that reflected the distressed market conditions of the proceeding rather than the asset's stabilized value under normal operating conditions. IHG's acquisition established a new debt basis significantly below KSL's 2013 acquisition price, creating the conditions for the kind of patient capital investment that the private equity structure had been unable to fund within its return timeline. IHG rebranded the Homestead as part of its Curio Collection, a portfolio of independent hotels with distinctive historic character, a positioning that aligned the resort's institutional identity with a brand framework designed for assets that derive their commercial value from specificity rather than standardization. The rebranding preserved the Homestead name, which is the asset's most valuable commercial property, while providing the loyalty program infrastructure and distribution channel access that an independent historic resort of the Homestead's size could not efficiently maintain without an institutional partner. What the Homestead case reveals about the broader pattern of institutional failure that this channel documents across 12 case files is the specific incompatibility between private equity return models and generational hospitality assets, whose commercial identity is inseparable from their historical continuity. The Fontainebleau was a new building over-leveraged at construction. The Plaza was a trophy asset over-leveraged at acquisition. The Waldorf was a fraudulent capital structure over-leveraged at transfer. The Homestead was a 230-year-old institution over-leveraged by a financial model that had worked everywhere else and failed here, because here was different in ways the model had no framework to price. The hot springs still flow at the same temperature they have maintained since the colonial period. The Allegheny Mountains have not moved. The guests whose grandparents brought their parents and whose parents brought them are still coming, at a rate that the IHG ownership structure is designed to accommodate rather than to arbitrage. The Chapter 11 proceeding that interrupted 230 years of continuous operation lasted 14 months. The continuity resumed. The private equity structure that interrupted it does not operate at the Homestead anymore. If this case file changed how you evaluate the application of private equity return models to generational hospitality assets, subscribe to this channel, because the next case examines a building that survived private equity, a pandemic, and a hostile city, and is still standing, though no one can agree on what it is worth or who should own it. And in the comments, given the Homestead's documented incompatibility with the standard private equity holding period, what specific capital structure would have allowed KSL to reposition the asset and achieve a market return without the Chapter 11 proceeding that the debt service timeline required? The case file is open.